Hello, kia ora, and welcome to the Creative Matters podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with artists from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm your host, Mandy Jakic. Hi, and thank you very much for joining me today. I just wanted to let you know that we are on Instagram, Creative Matters Podcast, and that is where I give you updates on the episodes and the new guests that we have coming, and also some examples of the artist's work. So I'd love you to join me on that platform. In the meantime, we are talking with Zoë Nash. Zoë is a multidisciplinary artist based in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. Her brightly coloured abstract works explore a slow and mindful accumulation of repeated and highly detailed mark-making. Reflecting her love of nature, Zoë's works increasingly draw on selected plant and flower motifs as inspiration, frequently initiated by things seen, things spoken, or things remembered. Narrative and nostalgia are also used to trigger personal connection with viewers. After taking some art classes with the lovely Zoë at Browne School of Art, it was a real privilege to talk to her and get to know her and her practice a little bit better. Zoë speaks about the roundabout way she came to design and the fine arts arena, and her challenging year completing a one-year master's degree in fine arts without actually having an art practice at the time, and how she didn't make art for 4 years after this experience. We discuss her identity crisis at the age of 30 as a British-born woman who had lived in New Zealand for as long as she'd lived in the UK, and how this translated into her fine arts study, which focused on identity, the use of autobiography, and the role of female narratives. Zoë talks about how renting her own art studio finally kick-started her art practice, and why her work became so connected to nature. She shares the ideas behind the presence of dots and repeated marks in her work, and how that can be therapeutic and sometimes reflects her own personal stories. And at the end of this episode, which is worth listening to all the way through, by the way, Zoë has the best list yet of artists and reasons why they have inspired her and informed her practice. Enjoy. Good afternoon, Zoë.
Good afternoon, Mandy.
It's not often I record in the afternoon, so it's very exciting to be able to say good afternoon. And we know each other. You have taught me twice at Browne School of Art, 2 glorious summer workshops in January this year and January last year. That's one of my big Christmas treats when I go and see Zoë and learn some more amazing stuff off you. And it's lovely to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It's lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this conversation goes.
Me too. And we're talking to each other via Zoom, and you've got a very similar plywood studio to me, so we look like we're twinning.
We do. And I'm wearing an orange cardigan, you have an orange microphone, so we're very in sync actually, and you have some artwork behind you that it looks like a strip of orange. It could be red, but yeah, we're very in tune with each other today.
Yeah.
So that's good.
That's good, isn't it? That's a good start. All right. So, I'm dying to hear your story, actually. So, take us back to the beginning, Zoë.
I was born in the UK in the 70s. So I grew up in the UK. Oh, this is a very long story, but yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. So my dad was one of those people, I guess, that always thought that the grass was maybe perhaps greener somewhere else, and he was kind of always yearning for something. And we moved around a lot when I was a child, and we actually emigrated 3 times. But yeah, I was in the UK, mainly in the UK up until the age of 15, and we had emigrated to Australia in 1981, stayed there for almost a year, and then returned to the UK. And then we moved to New Zealand in 1985, and we found ourselves in Te Awamutu. And at the time, I was a quite kind of arty, punky, sort of alternative young teenager. It was, the period of the new romantics, and all the guys I knew in Britain were wearing makeup and gelling their hair vertically. And to find yourself as a 15-year-old at that time in Te Awamutu was a culture shock, to say the least.
Yeah, I
But
can imagine.
I've been in New Zealand since the mid-80s. Yeah, I always thought I'd go back. So when I was 15, 16, I was adamant that I would return to the UK as soon as I turned 18. But by the time that came around, I was actually really enjoying life in New Zealand, and I'm still here. So that's
Mm,
great.
yeah, that is great. So, as a child, were you painting, or were you a creative child?
I was quite a creative child. I remember I drew a lot. I was really interested in books and in book design, actually, and I used to make a lot of books. I used to do a lot of, I guess, naive kind of book illustrations, and I used to write a lot of stories. I used to draw, funnily enough, I used to draw a lot of washing lines. So me and my friend Alison, I think it was actually all about the clothes, but we for years actually we drew washing lines, but it was really about drawing different outfits. So we would draw different items of clothing hanging on the washing lines. And yeah, it was all about fashion and color. And I am still very interested in fashion and clothes and how people choose to, I kind of present themselves, I suppose.
Mm.
But yeah, I did draw a lot, but I didn't grow up in a very creative or arty family. I was definitely an anomaly. And I grew up in a very kind of, I guess, working class background. And we didn't know people who were artists. We didn't know people who were creative. It was kind of a completely different world, I suppose. My parents both had very kind of standard jobs, and yeah, I didn't go to an art gallery until I was 17. So
Really?
yeah.
When you came to New Zealand, did you discover the art room at school? Was that kind of a safe space for you?
The art room definitely was my safe space. And Te Awamutu College in the mid-80s, there was not very many people doing art. I think when I did art in seventh form, which is year 13 now, so bursary level art, there was only 4 of us that did art. Um, but yeah, I hung out at the art rooms. I was not sporty at all. And so art was the place where I went. But I do remember at art, I guess it still happens, because I was talking to someone the other day about it, and they said it still happens. But as somebody that was interested in arts as a student, we did a lot of jobs at school. So the art students, we used to do all of the backdrops for all of the theatre productions, and we used to do all of the decorations for the school balls, and all of the poster design, and all of the art students ran the school magazine as well. So you actually were really involved in school life and in school productions. And I spent hours and hours in the art room, especially leading up to the school balls. We would sometimes be there till 10, 11 p.m. at night painting backdrops I remember one school ball, we did a Roman theme, and we were making Roman columns and painting these huge, huge backdrops. It was a lot of work. Yeah, it was great. And I did have an amazing art teacher, actually, that was really inspirational. And not coming from an artistic family, the passion that my art teacher at school showed me for art making was, so inspiring. And I think probably, she probably at the time, it was quite difficult for her being a female art teacher in a small country school. She probably didn't have as much support perhaps as the male economics teacher. I don't know, but yeah, she was amazing. Um, she did get pregnant though when I was in seventh form, and she left, and because there was only 4 of us, we got put in with the fifth form class. And it kind of went a bit downhill from there.
Oh no, what a shame. Isn't that crazy though that there are only four
Yeah,
people studying art?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they're all sort of farmers' kids and just weren't going down that road.
Yeah, it was very practical. I mean, when I was growing up, anything creative, because we didn't know anyone that was doing anything like that professionally. So it was always considered, a hobby or something that you could do as well as I'll do little speech marks here, but as well as your real job, you could choose to draw and paint if you wanted to, but it was never something that was considered as a viable career option. That
No.
the viable word is still somewhat problematic, but
Yes.
yeah.
So what did you decide to do? I mean, where did you go from there once you left school?
Well, I really, really wanted to go to art school, and because we had no art teacher, and because my parents really didn't see art at the time as something you could make a living from. I did not even apply to art school. And, I probably, when I think back to the art boards that I was making, and it's, funny to think that they still make those art boards, it seems quite antiquated.
Yes,
But
I agree.
yeah, it's a weird thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have got in because I wasn't super brilliant, and I didn't have these art boards that were A plus plus examples. So I was going to be a lawyer. LA law was very big on TV at the time, and there were a lot of programs about kind of social justice. And there's part of me, I guess, that has always kind of wanted to change the world or wanted to kind of look after people or protect people or be quite kind of community involved and dare I say the word, slightly socialist in terms of thinking, but I don't really want to get too much into politics, so we won't go down that route. But I was going to be a lawyer, and so I moved to Auckland. I did a year of law intermediate, and you had to do 6 arts papers, and I had always loved reading, and I had always loved literature, and I was very much a romantic kind of idealist, and so I really, really loved my English literature papers that I was doing and my history papers that I was doing. I hated law because I quickly realized that you could not go out there and change the world. You had to follow precedent, and there was a hell of a lot of research, and I wasn't going to be Ally McBeal standing in a courtroom changing things and making this huge, huge impact. I realized I'd probably be sitting in a dingy office somewhere doing a lot of paperwork. So
Yeah.
I carried on and I did English and history. And I didn't really do a lot of art making for many, many years, but every now and then a painting would pop up. It's like it had to kind of burst forth from within me. And so they did sort of pop up every now and then. And when I was at university, I remember, Tracy Collins was going to Elam Art School at the time, and she was always very noticeable with her vertical hair and her big black eyeliner at the time. And I used to look at people like her, and I used to watch them walking to Elam, and I used to be sitting there thinking, oh God, I just wish I was walking to Elam as well. And
Really.
sometimes I used to go to the Elam library just to look around, but I was not going to Elam.
Well, isn't that
But
interesting? You
yeah,
just had that sort of pull at that point, but you didn't really recognize it.
and I think I didn't have the confidence to do anything with it either. I felt that I wasn't going to succeed. I felt that I would potentially be rejected and it would be awful, and that I wasn't good enough because it just wasn't something that was on the radar of my family or any of the people that I hung out with.
Mm.
So yeah, after university, I actually worked in administration. I worked at Auckland College of Education when it was in Epsom for many, many years. And actually had a really good job there. And I worked with Graham Aitken, who at the time was the person who was organising all of the teaching experience placements for students. We worked in the School of Secondary Teacher Education. And, I had always kind of been drawn to teaching as well. And as a child, I did used to line up my toys in rows and pretend I was a teacher and set them little tests. And I quite enjoyed the marking process of that.
I
But
was the same, actually. I was very much
yeah,
like that. I used to bribe my little brother to sort of be in my classroom. And, from about the age of 8, I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I was. So interesting, isn't
yeah,
it?
it is. It's really funny. Like I didn't have this strong desire to be a teacher, but it's always been present in my life, and it's always been an option. And yeah, working at Teachers Training College was great, actually. I really enjoyed it, and I stayed there a long time. But eventually, it just long term, it wasn't creative enough for me, and I transitioned into design.
Ah, that's very interesting. How did you do that?
The person I was working for used to make a lot of their own resources, and he asked me, knowing that I could do a little bit of art. He asked me if I would do some illustrations for some of the publications that he was making to give out to students, and they were all about professional teaching practice, full of some very good information, which I used to read actually as I was making them. So between us, we would make these publications. Um, Apple Mac computers were just coming out, and so Auckland College of Education, there was a moment where we transitioned from having no computers on our desk to all having a computer. And I was really interested in the concept of kind of making things. And, I had made those books a lot when I was little, which were, just made with staples and sellotape and my felt tip pens. But this idea that you could design something and you could make it on a computer and you could print it out and it would be a thing, that was really exciting. And so me and a person I worked with begged the person who was the head of design, so he was a lecturer working at Auckland College of Education, we begged him if he would teach us how to use these new design programs that were coming in. And he was really lovely. His name was Kerry Guy, actually. And he taught us how to use some of the design programs. And then it was Margaret Allingham and I went and started creating for the School of Secondary Teacher Education a whole lot of little publications. And then I thought, this is actually really good. And maybe I could get into book design, and that would be amazing. And then after nearly 4 years working at Auckland College of Education, I saw this job come up for a design assistant for Reed Publishing. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna try and see if I can do that. And I successfully got that job, which was amazing. And
Mm.
so I worked at Reed Publishing for probably about 4 years. Again, started off as a design assistant, which was basically formatting text for books. And somebody else was the designer, and I would be the pleb at the end who would format all of the pages. So it was precise, but it wasn't as creative as I wanted it to be. But I did have an amazing design director, a guy called Chris Lipscomb, who kindly taught me design. He used to run these little mini workshops for me. So, I look back and I think a lot of what I did was self-initiated and self-taught, and especially at the beginning, kind of asking people that I worked with, asking them for help, showing a willingness, showing a keenness, doing things like going in on the weekends and having little private lessons and stuff. And I was lucky in that people were really open to helping me at the time. But Chris was amazing. I remember when he told me that type and letters, like letter design, typefaces, were unique and were distinct, and the shape and the form of the letters was something that referenced the story or the content that the publication was about. And that was like a light bulb moment, that realization that everything visually is part of the whole bigger picture, and you make these decisions. And yeah, the fact that type had personality, that was mind-blowing. But it really, working with him really sparked or developed, I guess, my ever increasing growing interest in shape and design and color and form. And I worked a lot with a woman who became a really good friend of mine, Claire Lansley, who was a book designer at the time for Reed Publishing, and she used to let me help her on projects, and we did a lot of co-design. And yeah, that was kind of how I got into that design field, and I worked in design. I kind of worked my way up without having formal qualifications. And I don't know if you could do this anymore without having that degree under your belt, but at the time you could. So I kind of did a lot of on-the-job training. And wherever there was a course, I did it. Whenever there was weekend workshops, I did it. Chris was amazing in that he instigated what he called these design day outs for our design department. And we would go en masse. Reed Publishing was in Birkenhead, so we'd go en masse in Chris's car out for these day trips to places like the Auckland City Art Gallery and Borders Bookshop and Parsons Bookshop. And we'd go and we'd have these inspirational days. Yeah, that was amazing. And having that idea of sort of feeding your creativity, going and looking at things, that's still really important.
And how amazing. I mean, he must have been quite a mentor for you, I guess. And it's interesting, isn't it, now that you are in that sort of educating field, you're probably doing the same a lot to other people. You're kind of paying it forward in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I think those influential people that you have had in your past, do have an impact on your life and do kind of carry you forward. And I hope that I can take the experiences that I've had, which, have been a very kind of somewhat long and windy way into this fine arts arena. And I hope that that does inspire other people.
Yeah, I'm quite sure it does. Yeah. And I honestly do think that you can bring something else to your teaching practice when you have had a journey like that. I think it makes you, the way that you work and what you get across to students is, well, you're very relatable and people connect with you and you, it's not, you're more accessible in some ways because of your background.
Yeah, and I think, I teach adult students. I have never had a desire to teach children. I have tried it and it was not for me. But the joy of teaching mature students is that everyone that comes into the classroom comes with their own kind of wealth of different experiences also. And so I'm constantly learning. The great thing about teaching is that you yourself are always learning. And it was said to me many, many years ago, but if you want to really understand something, to try and teach it. So teaching it, you have to go away and you have to research and you have to be prepared. And that's really exciting and kind of drives the passion. And the fact that it's a mutually beneficial kind of learning space is great.
Yeah, it really is great. Yeah, I love working with adults as well. Yeah. And so how did you actually go from there into becoming an artist and becoming a teacher?
So I worked in design probably full time for, excuse me, probably about 7 years, I suppose. And I was in Auckland. I moved to New Plymouth for personal reasons. And when I moved to New Plymouth, having come from working in design and working in book publishing, I was the only person that at that time knew how to operate a particular software that was used in publication design called Quark Express, which is really going to date me. But nobody in New Plymouth, when I got there, knew how to use Quark Express, and Taranaki Polytech was wanting to bring in this new publication software for its students, but they didn't have a tutor. I was working in the design department of a printing company, which was based in Bell Block on the outskirts of New Plymouth. And I was asked if I would go and teach one class per week of Quark Express to students who are doing publication design. And I thought, that could be kind of interesting. and I didn't particularly love being out at this printing company in Bell Block. It was quite isolating and kind of in the middle of nowhere. And so I went and did this one class a week, and, having been in education before and then being back in that educational environment, even though I was initially, when I started it, I was so terrified of teaching. And I do remember that disgustingly, and I do not do this anymore and I do not condone it, but I was a smoker at the time. And ahead of my first lesson, I think I chain smoked about 15 cigarettes. I was so nervous. And yeah, it was a horrific experience to put myself through this thought of going publicly into a room and having to talk about something that I did know about, but it was really terrifying. The nerves have dissipated over the years, but it certainly still is a performative process,
It
I would
really
say.
is. Yeah. And you have to be sort of on your game. Whether you're teaching children or adults, it's the same. It's like you sort of just click into your teacher mode, regardless of how you're feeling or how your morning's been or whatever. And yeah, it is quite a performance, isn't it, in a way? And it is, I remember that feeling as well, especially when I first started teaching teachers. I was just like, oh my God, how can I teach the teachers? Like
Yeah,
I'm not expert enough to do that, you know. But as I've got older, I have realized that I actually do have a lot of experience and I can
yeah,
contribute
yeah,
something, you know. I love it
yeah.
so much, which is I think is how you feel as well.
Yeah, I totally love it. But yeah, it was a big change when I first started. But yeah, I absolutely have a huge passion for it now, and I love working with the students, and I love seeing people start in one place, and through the help and the conversations that you've had with them, they're able to get through to a different space and a different way of thinking, and it's really inspiring and really, yeah, just lovely seeing people develop and seeing them happy in their development as well.
Yeah.
So with Taranaki Polytech, I started doing that one class a week, and then I enjoyed it so much once I got over the initial shock that I thought, okay, I'm gonna get myself a job here. And I did, again, I just worked, I just pestered them. I said, can I have some more hours? Can I do this class? Can I do that? There was writing about art was one of the classes. Like, I can teach writing about art. I've got a degree in English. I've got a degree in history. I can do that. I didn't know how to do it at all. But, I figured it all out. And within a year I was teaching full time. And
Really.
of course, I still had my eye on the art department, though. So while I was teaching design, I was still looking at the art department, and I was thinking, I'm going to blooming do some art papers while I'm here because I might as well. So in my spare time, I did a few arts papers, and I slowly transitioned myself from design into fine art, which is where I really wanted to be. And while I was teaching there, yeah, when I began that job, we were teaching a diploma level classes, and we decided that we would become a degree level program. And at that point, to maintain my job, to keep my job, and it happened to everyone teaching at that time, you had to make sure that your qualification was a higher level than the qualification of the students that you were teaching. And so I had to get my master's degree if I wanted to continue my academic teaching career. And that's what I did. And then I crazily thought, okay, this is the time that I'm going to move into fine art. This is my opportunity. I'm going to do my master's degree. I don't want to do it in design. I want to do it in art. And that was a crazy idea, and it was really hard. But
I
that's what I did.
bet. And that was a fine art, master in fine arts.
It was a master in fine arts. I did not
Wow.
have an arts practice. And, if I could do that master's degree now, I would be in such a stronger position than I was then because, yeah, I didn't really have a clue. And I'd like to apologize to all the staff at Whitecliff for the fact that I had no idea what I was doing at the time. I remember the head of fine art at the time said to me, Zoe, I'm not your client. You are not a designer. you don't have to try and please me all of the time. You have to do what you want to do.
Really?
And at that time, I actually didn't know what I really wanted to do.
No. Well, you probably hadn't done enough kind of playing and experimenting and
No.
you know, working through your thoughts. That is an amazing thing to do, Zoe, is to, to head back and put yourself in out of your comfort zone and to, I guess, do something that you'd always kind of had under your skin in some way. What were you making then, and did it have any reference to what you're doing now?
It's funny that things do, and I talk to the students that I teach a lot about this, but the things that you do in your life, they do have a funny way of kind of coming back around again and being more relevant. And you can sort of, when you look back, you can see the importance of them still now and see the relevance that they had on what you're doing, or that they have on what you're making right now. So yeah, it does come around. So when I was doing my master's, just before I began that, like I said earlier, every now and then these paintings would kind of just pop out, that I just felt this overwhelming urge to create. And I just, it was like they were within me and they just had to come out, and they were pretty naive, to be honest. But I had been making these paintings that were kind of mostly actually inspired by my garden, or inspired by plants, inspired by nature. So all of those paintings that sort of burst forth from me, probably 90% of them were to do with nature. Every now and then there was the odd little interior, and none of them exist anymore because they were all made with, don't do this. They were all made with student paints, and they were all made on canvases that my partner stretched for me, that were all wonky and shonky and odd, and they're all in the bin, which is actually a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
But their presence is still with me. So I had been doing these flower paintings. When I started my master's, I turned 30, and I had this quite a big identity crisis. So having been in the UK up until the age of 15, I had always thought of myself as being British. And then when I turned 30, the day after I turned 30, I was like, okay, you have been living in New Zealand longer than you have been in Britain. Can you keep saying you're British if you live longer in New Zealand? At what point are you a New Zealander? And at what point do you stop saying you're British when you haven't been there for years and your life is not there? And I had this huge identity crisis. And I started my master's, and I was really interested in autobiography and in personal stories, and in the idea that the stories you kind of tell yourself are your identity, and the memories that you have, the experiences that you've had are your identity, and what happens to you makes you who you are. And I'm, that whole sort of nurture nature conflict is still very present in my life, and something that I still consider quite a lot. But I was
Yeah.
looking at autobiography in art. I was also really interested at the time. It was kind of the late 90s, and there was a whole thing to do in Britain with, the whole sort of Brit pop art movement, and there was a really big kind of music revival, and a lot of British politics were very popularist, and there was all of those sensation shows that Charles Saatchi was putting on, and there was a category of art that was very much talked about in the media, which was bad girl art. And having been a rebel kind of punk in my youth, and I did a lot of feminist studies at Auckland University as well. So I'd always been quite interested in these sort of, in a strong female identity, and in kind of being non-conformist as much as you wanted to be, and not falling into these stereotypes of what you ought to be doing. And that had always been really important. And so I decided I would do my master's looking at bad girl art, looking at identity, and looking at the use of autobiography and the role of female narratives in terms of how you present identity, and talking about this idea of multiple identities and the idea of a fluid identity as well. So yeah, I was looking at a lot of artists that used autobiography in their work, and also a lot of quite strong kind of feminist artists. And I was making art that was using, I had always kept a diary as a teenager, and I still have all those diaries, which I really should get rid of them. But I was using a lot of source material from my actual diaries to make the work that I was making then. And I was, I've never been afraid to do things on quite a large scale. And I was doing a lot of installation type of work. And I was doing things like using recordings of me saying the text from the diaries that I've written, and using that text and the artwork. Yeah, the concept I think was quite strong, but because I wasn't hugely experienced in terms of the way that I wanted to make my work, probably the execution wasn't brilliant. But I did, having said that, I did do some really cool things. So for my final end of year show for my MFA, I made, with the help of a few people, but I recreated the 1970 or the 1980s bedroom that I had as a teenager. And it was inside the gallery space, and it was a big installation that was built, and it had, actual furniture inside it. And I'd sourced furniture that was exactly the same as the furniture that I had. I still had, because my mum had always kind of liked to keep things. It's maybe and the dilemma of the immigrant is that you hang on to stuff. But I did have all of the paraphernalia that I had as an angsty teenager. So I had all of my posters, and I had pictures that were from my wall. I had all of my diaries. I had the same bedspread. I had the same lamp. And so I recreated the bedroom of my youth, and I used, wallpaper and bricks and an actual door. And it was this big, real size installation that you went into.
How amazing.
Yeah, it was cool. But, things like that, they don't exist. They are made for the space. Once you take them down, that was built in the space. So it just got dismantled and it doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, there were parts of what I was making at the time that were very kind of innovative and exciting. And yeah, it was the execution. I look back now and I think, yeah, I could, if I was making them now, they would just be so much stronger. And like you said before, I didn't have those years of experience, I guess, in terms of an arts practice.
And there are many fine arts students, who come out of school at 18 and might end up with a master's at 22, and they're the same in a way.
Yeah.
But they've had those 3 years of fine arts before, I guess, which would have been helpful. Yeah. So how did you, at that point, were you thinking, right, I'm going to be a full-time artist, or I want to teach and be an artist, or what were you thinking coming out of university?
I had done that MFA in order to keep teaching at tertiary level, and the whole thing, doing that MFA was quite a traumatic experience at the time. And I worked with some amazing people, but I think the work I was making was quite polarizing. And so I worked with Judy Dara, was my studio mentor, and funnily enough, Tracy Collins was my studio mentor. And I specifically had chosen to work with strong female artists who were a little bit kind of anti-establishment, or a little bit kind of doing their own thing, going against the grain, doing things that were not kind of standard practice, doing things that were much more experimental, much more, I love Judy Dara's approach to community initiatives and accessibility of art making, and obviously her use of found objects as well. But I had chosen to work with people that existed outside of the mainstream kind of academic culture. There were struggles at the time in terms of, where I sat, I guess, in terms of grading and things like that. And I hadn't, because that experience of doing my master's was so polarizing, I didn't feel super strong, I guess, in terms of where I was at as an artist. And it was so difficult at the time that I didn't make any art. I made one work not that long after that did get into the Waikato Contemporary Art Awards as a finalist, which was kind of great. But after that work, so that sort of came at the end of my MFA. After that, I just stopped making art for a really, really long time.
Really?
And I wanted to make it, but I just didn't know what path I wanted to take. I didn't know what direction I wanted to go in. And I just threw myself into full-time teaching. So I moved after finishing my MFA. I moved from Taranaki back to Auckland, and I actually went back and worked in design. And I taught at what was then NatCol, which is now UB, but I taught there full-time for nearly 4 years, and I didn't make any art.
Gosh, that's really amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. But then
Wow.
it came back, art came out. I went and got a studio. So I was quite good friends with a woman called Jane Mitchell, who I'm still friends with now, a very, very successful artist in her own right. And she had studio space in the Sunday School building above the Comedy Club on Queen Street. And a space became available in that building. And, I'd done my master's, and I remember having a discussion actually with my partner, and he said, what was the point of you doing your master's if you're not going to do any art? And I was like, oh, well, I'm too busy teaching to do any art, but I still really wanted to. And I was like, okay, maybe I should take the studio space that Jane said was available. And maybe if I had a studio, I could go and I could just do something and kind of see where that takes me. And so I took on a studio space in that building, which, was full of, and is still full of, some incredibly talented and well-respected artists. And I guess taking on that space was what kicked it off.
Mm.
And so then I stopped working and I went every day to my studio in Queen Street, but I didn't really have a plan.
Mm. But how good to finally kind of give yourself that time and space.
Yeah. I mean, it was something that I needed to do. But I do have to say, actually, that, it might suit some people, but for me, working every day, going into my studio, was actually very lonely. I found it really lonely. And probably within 6 months, after 2 months, I was like, oh God, this is so lonely. I came to the realization that I actually needed people in my life as well. So the great thing about teaching is that you're always surrounded by people, and you're always having these great conversations, and it's always quite inspiring. And even if it's sometimes not so inspiring, and maybe people are having problems and there's some pastoral care involved, you still kind of feel part of something, and you still feel like you're giving something back to people and you're being helpful and useful. And when I was there in my studio every single day by myself with the door shut, just sort of, I felt like I was twittering around. In hindsight, it was really great development, and it was probably what needed to be done. But I went back to teaching part-time, and then I kind of discovered the perfect balance, I guess, is
Yeah.
for me, is to do a little bit of teaching and as much as I can of art making, and that's that kind of happy spot, that happy medium.
Mm. Yeah,
Too
that's
much to
brilliant.
one side it's too hard for me.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's so good that you worked that out for yourself. And so, for people who've never seen the beautiful work of Zoë Nash, can you describe your paintings to us?
I guess in a word, they're accumulative. They're process driven. So they're very repetitive, very patterny. There's a lot of build up of specific chosen methods of application that are done over and over again. And it's the kind of the making of the work is part of the work, but increasingly I guess they've always had this kind of nature influence, and definitely over the last few years they have become much more nature inspired, possibly post COVID. During COVID, I did a lot of walks, as everyone else did, but a lot of walks. I'm lucky enough to live in coastal West Auckland, and it's very bushclad, and I'm also by the sea, and it's really beautiful. But for me, the happiest times of my life have actually been walks in nature. And when I think about autobiography and the impact, like I said before, of events on your life, as a child, I spent hours and hours walking with my granddad through various woodlands across Britain, and with dogs, of course, with dogs in tow, but they were happy places for me. And my granddad used to tell me a lot about plants and a lot about nature, and we used to look for certain things, so we knew where the badgers' sets were. I think they're sets. I think they're called sets. And the foxes' dens, and we knew where the wild strawberries grew, and we knew where the wild mushrooms were, and we used to look for fairy rings, and we used to look for conkers, and we used to eat chestnuts, and all of these childhood memories that were happy for me kind of come back into play again in my life now. And so for me, I'm at my most happy when I'm walking in nature, and I'm always looking at things, and I'm looking quite often for patterns in nature, and it's that the kind of joy of discovery and the idea of celebrating late nature, and that sense of delight if you come across something, finding a bird's nest, for example, or finding an amazing just about to bloom flower. These are things that are really beautiful and really heartwarming for me, and my work increasingly looks to nature for its inspiration, and is a celebration of nature, but is a celebration, I guess, of kind of walking in nature as well, and also a celebration of that kind of mindful, repetitive,
Mm,
slow, reflective practice.
yeah, with a real focus on process, and it's also a celebration of shape and form and pattern, and
Yeah.
you seem to play with sort of depth and perspectives as well, which I guess comes out of all of that sort of layering, layer upon layer, um, which is so beautiful. It's almost like you feel like you can, lose yourself in the works, especially some works more than others. I mean, some of your works are very abstract. I mean, they're all, I guess, abstract, but they have sort of realistic shapes sometimes and sometimes not. So, how do you go about that?
I guess to me the kind of the crux of them always there's been something in nature that has been the kind of the sort of the starting point, the initial source of inspiration. So in the past, I have made quite a lot of site-specific installations, and I've done lots of pieces for the Harbourview Sculpture Trails when they were on in Te Atatu for several years, and I contribute regularly to the Kaipara Coast Sculpture Trail, sorry, not trail. um, and a lot of the works that I've made for those, initially have appeared to be very abstract upon first viewing. One that I made once for the Kaipara Coast Sculpture Trail was a whole load of circles that were bright orange and vivid white, and they sat in amongst a whole load of pine trees in this kind of little copse that was very dark, so the colours really popped out. They weren't really abstract shapes at all. They were inspired by the rings of a tree, the age of the tree, when you cut the tree, when you slice the tree down, and you can see all those rings.
Yeah.
But that's where that shape came from originally. So sometimes it's taking sort of like a very, very simple nugget of a concept that is more often than not something that I've seen in nature, but then kind of expanding upon it or seeing what you can do with it, seeing how far you can take it, seeing in some cases how unrecognizable you can make it. But I think my more recent work is the plant specimens that I'm choosing to focus on are much more obvious at the moment in my practice.
Yeah. But just the way that you work, I mean, it is quite fascinating to look closely at your paintings to sort of figure out exactly what your process is. So can you, I know it's probably a big ask, but can you kind of unpack your process?
Yeah, I mean, the answer varies, I guess, dependent on different works. So, some of them come from a different starting point than others. If we focus on my more recent work, which has in the past, probably the past 5 years, I guess, been predominantly two-dimensional work, so drawings and paintings. If I think about a painting that has been completed recently, as an example, something like Bluebell Wood, which I completed a couple of years ago now. That was very much inspired by me one day just happening to be, I think I might have seen it actually. I might have been walking along and I might have seen maybe it's forget-me-nots.
Yeah.
So I might have seen those. Those are the ones that grow wild as weeds, aren't
Yeah.
they?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it must have been those. So I was walking along, walking with the dog, saw those plants, and then I'm carrying on walking, and I'm thinking about those plants and how they used to be in the woods that I walked in with my granddad, which then got me onto thinking about bluebells. And then I was like, oh, yeah, remember that time when you saw that amazing, you were in that woodland and it was somewhere in Britain and you saw that, like that field of bluebells. They were, you looked ahead of you and there were just bazillions of bluebells and it was like this sea of blue or sea of violet with
Yeah.
this like really bright green color. And I was thinking about how that made me feel and this idea of it being this quite immersive experience. And then I was like, yeah, I want to paint those. That's what I want to paint. And so a memory is often my starting point. It's a memory of something, and it's a memory of something that I've maybe seen, 5 minutes ago, or sometimes it's a memory from, dare I say it, 40, 50 years ago. But it's the memory and the story that
And
are the
yeah,
starting.
the feeling that place gave you, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So it starts with the memory, which is why, that the autobiography work that I was looking at, that's still relevant in my practice now. So like I said before, everything's sort of, I think maybe the older you get, things start all feeding into each other and you see how they all become a part of who you are and what you're doing. And you can see the relevance in retrospect much more than you can at the time. So I'll start with that memory, and so I'll be channeling something like bluebells, and yeah, with that work, that was an acrylic work on board. Yeah, I will have a process that I follow in terms of the painting. So there's lots of, basically just lots and lots of layers. I will start off with underpainting. I'm really drawn to color. I've never been afraid of color, and I love color. I really am drawn to fashion and to textile design as well. So I think that design component is still present in everything that I do. And yeah, that interest in color and shape and form. But like you say, that emotional connection has to be there. And it is the emotional connection to the memory and the story that brings forth, I guess, from me, and that the ability of the stories to be talking points and points of connection that you can make with your viewer, that's really important. So if someone is looking at my work and they can say, oh, I remember seeing those bluebells when I was a child, or I remember my grandmother had some of those in her garden, then we can have a conversation, then we can make a connection, then we can share an experience, and the artwork has enabled all of that to happen. So this idea of sharing stories and making connections with people is really important also. I hope that my artwork, enables those conversations to happen.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. They're definitely very thought-provoking. And it's a powerful thing, isn't it? Responding to the places that you've been or the place that you are. We talked about this in the last episode with Belinda, actually, just how much you can be influenced by what's around you. And yeah, I have very vivid memories of my grandparents' garden and the what's the yellow berry with a little sort of see-through sack that it sits in,
Like gooseberries, kind of.
gooseberry. Yeah, gooseberry. Yeah, the yellow
Yeah,
gooseberry
yeah,
bush. Yeah, which is you don't often see actually these days. But even though I didn't realize I was connected or interested in anything like that as a child, it still kind of permeates into who I am
yeah,
today and how much I love my garden and nature and the bushwalks around here at Muriwai, and
yeah,
it is a powerful thing. And then my work responds to place as well. So
yeah.
yeah, it's powerful, isn't it? And it's almost
Really
like a
powerful, yeah.
subconscious power that you
Yeah.
don't even realize.
If you were walking along and you just happened to see a gooseberry plant and you saw that, that would take you right back to
Mm.
being that child again with your grandparents. And yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And now as a grandparent myself, you know, I've been building this garden for my future grandchildren for probably 10 years, even
Yeah.
though, my kids would have been teenagers. But I always felt like some kids were going to come to me and they were going to grow up in this garden. And I love the thought that they will have these memories of what they probably think of as this massive, crazy garden as little people. And yeah, and I've made the paths with them in mind almost. And it's like it's just repeating that beautiful experience that I had and then passing that on and then creating memories for the next generation, which is just such an honor.
Yeah, it is. And I think the joy of being in nature, it's such a sanctuary and such a place of comfort so often for so many people. And you know, unless you've had some awful traumatic experience, which I guess some of us have had with recent flooding, etc. But, for the most part, nature is a happy place for people and is a place that they will go to for comfort. And, there's the way our language works, there's a whole load of phrases to do with sort of going out and clearing your head and going for a
Mm,
walk and getting some space. And yeah, that idea of nature is everything. Nature is all, and it surprises me that nature is such a strong driving force of my practice because I didn't realize quite how big a part of my life it was. But it is, and like you, I've always been quite interested in gardening, mainly from the design perspective rather
yeah.
than the hard labor perspective. I get someone else to do that. But yeah, having a great garden, growing plants, nurturing things, and just being in nature is
Mm.
wonderful.
And it's very much a design thing, gardening. That's what I love about it as well. It's just all about shape, form, composition, space, all those things that your paintings are. And
Yeah.
as far as the paint, do you always use acrylics?
I mainly use acrylics. I went through a phase of using enamel paints for a while. So there was something really enticing about the slickness, the shininess of them, I dare I say the smell of them was quite nice, even though potentially a bit toxic. But yeah, I loved the way the enamels, I still do love them. I love the way they sit on the surface, and I love the gloss and the sheen. And I'm very interested in paint itself and in the way paint works and the way paint sits on a surface. And I guess I'm seduced by paint and I enjoy playing with paint. But I I appreciate a good painterly artist and
Yeah.
someone whose work celebrates the act of painting. And yeah, enamels I've dipped into. I do sometimes take quite a mixed media approach in the work that I make. And obviously, I consider myself a multidisciplinary artist. So a lot of the things that I've done in the past have been more sculptural or maybe have used collage as well. But yeah, more recently, I've been focusing on acrylics.
Mm. And the dots and well, they are kind of like blobs and dots, and sometimes they can be quite raised. And there's just often, so many levels of those dots that sometimes they don't even look like dots until you really look closely. Is that something to do with the sort of a therapy or, the therapeutic action of creating those dots? Or what is it about dots that keep coming up in your work, do you think?
Dots have been present for a really, really long time in my work. I couldn't say exactly where they came from, apart from when I first had my art studio in town. I was, I don't want to talk about this too much, but I was quite focused on trying to make babies at that time. And it proved to be more of a struggle than anticipated. And when I had that studio, I was undergoing a lot of medical intervention, shall we say. And I think I was quite focused on the idea of eggs and cells and bodies, and these dots started appearing. And then they kind of just grew and grew and grew. And the dots, they've gone away sometimes, but they've always come back. There's something I guess really just pure and simple, a single cell, it's cellular, it is life, it's science, it's nature, it's biology, it's everything. Everything
Mm,
is cellular. We are, break us down and we're just all made of dots. I don't know how they stick together, but
yeah.
that's what we are. So there's something kind of life affirming, I guess, about this idea of a circle. I've made lots of works that are circular, and I guess there's something kind of complete and something whole. There's something really pure about the shape of a circle. There's something eternal. There's so many things.
Mm,
And yeah, they're just there. Even when sometimes I try not to do dots, but they just come back. They want to be there. They tell me that they want to be there, so they have to be there. But
mm,
I think they originally began as this kind of a obsession with sort of medical practices and with cells and with life and death and all of those biological scientific sorts of
mm,
things. I think that was their root source. And then of course, I've always been really interested in microscopic studies of nature and in cells and in slightly odd things to do with life and death. Taxidermy quite interests me, sort of things that are a little bit weird and grotesque. So the scientific aspect is good. And
that's really interesting.
yeah,
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry you went through that time. That would have been really challenging. And it is lovely in a way that you are making reference to that in your work. It's another sort of autobiographical aspect, I guess, which
exactly.
is very meaningful.
The autobiography isn't sometimes obvious to other people, but if you spoke to me and heard the stories, then I could tell you, some of those dots, I made a series of drawings that were called All the Tears I Never Cried, and they were dots, but they were splats. They were dots done from high above, so they were dots with gravity, but they were representative of tears. And there was a lot of those drawings that were
Mm,
dots,
mm.
but they were tears as well.
Yeah, that makes me feel quite emotional.
Yeah, and I've this idea of artists using their life experiences to generate their art is really powerful. And I like what you said about therapy, because, taking something that's very personal and very internal, and an experience that is not unique to you, but, yours, and then kind of, I guess, turning it around on itself, taking it from being an internal emotion to something that is visually expressed externally, is really therapeutic. And I have used that mindful dot making and that mindful making of marks. So sometimes my works have been very scribbly, sometimes they've been very line based, but it's always been this process of accumulation. But there's definitely something therapeutic in just the slow, mindful, consistent, repetitive making of the mark. Or, I made a lot of works that were kind of inspired by birds' nests, but they were sculptural, three-dimensional pieces. And so that process of bending and twisting and weaving was part of those. But again, it's that, repeating the same, I'll call it mark making, repeating the same thing ad infinitum, really, to the point where it sometimes gives you RSI, but it does give you that headspace to be reflective and to kind of deal with things. So I mean, there's, the art is therapeutic. Art is a sanctuary.
Yeah, it
Art is a
absolutely
savior.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. You can tell the stories if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then people can connect to your works in their own way and bring their own stories and bring their own memories and nostalgia to it.
And I hope that I try to make the titles perhaps trigger a connection or a story or a shared experience with the viewer as well.
So you have a show coming up, which is from today. It's open today until the 22nd of June, 2024, at Railway Street Gallery and Studios in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. And it's called Delightfully Pernicious. Is
Yes.
that correct? I had to ask Siri how to say that, and then also what it actually meant. I was like, pernicious. No, it's not pernicious.
Yeah.
Pernicious, and then it's like pernicious. So that means having a harmful effect in a subtle way. Thank you, Siri. So can you
Yes.
tell us about that show and a little bit about the Railway Street Gallery and what we might expect when we go along?
Sure. So I'll let you in on a secret, in that, until I came upon that title, I had not heard the word pernicious before either.
Good.
And I only came across it because I was doing a thesaurus search on the word noxious. So for this show, I have focused on 3 species of plant or flower that are delightfully pernicious. And I'd been doing a little bit of background research into this idea of species that are perhaps problematic, particularly in our current sort of post-colonial world that we live in. And I'd been looking up noxious and toxic, and that was when pernicious came up, and I thought, oh, that's a good word. I
That's a
also
great word.
how
I
to
love it.
pronounce it. So I'm having a show that's opened as of today. And yes, is at Railway Street Gallery and Studios in Newmarket. This is the second time that I've had a show there, and it's a really lovely space. I am sharing that space this time with an artist called Bev Goodwin, who is a lovely person who makes quite quirky sculptural works using found, upcycled, recycled materials. She has done a lot of works that are very colourful in the past, and I've been looking at her work for a long time, and I've sort of seen some similarities in terms of some of the way that we've made our pieces. So I think that our works complement each other really nicely. So she is in the downstairs gallery and I'm in the upstairs gallery, and we kind of come under the umbrella of Flora. So my part of the show is Delightfully Pernicious, and hers is called Pacifica Blooms et al. And she's made a whole lot of sculptures that are, very flora forward, shall we say. And my works for this show are very flora forward as well. So unintentionally when I began, but became more cohesive as this show started to come together. I had painted a work that was inspired by arum lilies, and I had, as I'm walking my dog, which I do every day, I'm walking around looking at my West Coast Auckland bush-clad hillsides where I walk, and every now and then I'm spotting lilies that I've always loved. And I remember as I'm walking all of the times that I've made my partner climb up and down hills and valleys and on the edges of rivers trying to pick me lilies, because I go, oh, that one over there looks really good. I'd like that one in a vase in the house. And lilies have always brought great joy and delight if I've seen them. And there's something amazingly sculptural as well and pure and perfect about an arum lily, the perfect specimen, just beginning to bloom. And so I've always loved them. And so I had made this painting about arum lilies. And then I had also, in my last show, I'd done a couple of works that were inspired by what I was calling Datura at the time, because I do have a Datura plant growing in my garden, and I've always really loved those. I love the shape of them. I love the smell of them. And so I'd done a work in my previous show based on Datura, based on looking out of my window from my studio. And then I kind of saw this connection between the two. And I'm also really inspired by nasturtiums, which I see every day when I'm walking the dog also. And so I thought I would focus on these three particular plants. And, the more I thought about them, the more I realized that, they are problematic. And there's that fact that they're non-native species. They're considered quite invasive. They're quite toxic. But they're, for me personally, they're also really lovely and really beautiful. And I really enjoy it. And then they make me smile when I see them. And there's a conflict there, because I don't want to see them not be there. And there's people in my local area even that are very enthusiastically trying to get rid of all of the introduced species and going around chopping the heads off agapanthus and things. And I do totally see where they're coming from, and I can completely understand this desire to, not have these introduced species in Aotearoa. But then that's problematic, because, you can't kind of return to the complete past. And, do you live in a world where only native plants live in the countries in which they originated from? I don't know. It's all really difficult and confusing. And then the plants that I chose to look at, the more that I researched them, and half of this I knew anyway, particularly with the Datura, is that they're really quite toxic. So there's that toxicity to them, and the fact that they're poisonous. That is a little bit like the kind of the whole bad girls sort of thing.
Yeah, really connect.
But that slightly rebellious element that they have to them, and the fact that I'm here nurturing them, growing them in my garden, is kind of naughty. Oh, it's
I
bad.
love that. It's like your own little punks in your
Yeah,
garden.
it is. It is.
But
So,
nasturtiums aren't poisonous, are they?
well, I didn't think they were either, because of course you can put them in salads and we can eat them, and they actually taste really lovely and they're really peppery. But yeah, in the wrong amounts, they can be toxic. So they're used quite a lot in medicine. But yeah, if you have too much for a good thing, I guess.
Really?
You probably have to eat a lot of them, I would say, for them to be toxic. But
Yeah.
arum lilies are on the top 10 most poisonous plants in New Zealand
Yeah.
list. And
Wow.
of course, the datura, which as I looked more and more into this plant, I did realize quite soon on that the datura that I was looking at are actually Brugmansia, they're angel's trumpets. So the ones that have the flowers growing downwards from above are angel's trumpets or Brugmansia. The ones that grow up from the ground are officially datura, and the species have been separated into two. But that's what I'm looking at in the show. So I'm looking at these three specimens, and I'm using this process of layering to kind of illustrate and emphasize ideas to do with toxicity and slightly potentially sort of trippy interpretations. There's something kind of bewitching and enchanting, seductive about them, but they are, problematic.
That's so
I enjoy
interesting.
that. I
And
enjoy the conflict.
yeah, it's the conflict, and it is going back to that sort of rebellious young Zoe, I guess. But what do you think what was it that initially drew you to the toxicity sort of side of things, or was it just purely that you were interested in the form?
Well, it's again a case of things kind of coming around. Initially it was the shape of the angel's trumpet and the smell of them. That was what made me go and buy these shrubs and plant them in my garden. It was the fact that they smelled so amazing and they're so abundant in the number of blooms that they have. And they have a good innings of flowering. They last a really long time.
Mm.
But the fact that they were also dangerous and they were really toxic and potentially fatal, that was kind of appealing as well. Uh,
Mm. Pretty and deathly.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I liked that contradiction, and I liked
Mm.
the fact that they were a little bit dangerous. And I've spent many hours telling my children not to touch them at all. So that was really enticing and attractive to me. Um, And of course, I'm looking at them. I'm looking at my angel's trumpet as I'm here in my studio. But it did make me think about, when I was at university, I was very interested in popular culture, and I didn't really study the kings and queens or anything. I was interested in the history of the common people, and I did a lot of papers on witchcraft and a lot of papers looking at the role of women in medieval society. And so that, I don't know a huge amount about it, and it's probably not something that I'm going to look into deeply, but that connection of women to plants and to medicinal botany, and that idea of, women that live on the outskirts of society, or perhaps are, slightly alienated, or, the people that are considered the weirdos of society, and what has happened to them in the past, and the condemnation of those, of things that live outside of what is considered acceptable behavior. And, these plants, because of their toxicity, kind of represented that as well. And so a lot of these plants are used in contemporary medicines, and there was something that sort of brought all of those connections together that was present in those three particular species that I've chosen to focus on for this show.
Mm. That's
Makes
really
sense.
interesting. It's fascinating. And these works are using lots of dots and that sort of interesting way you approach perspective and depth and that kind of thing. And it's got all the shapes and beautiful forms, which, you see in your work. But I also love that sort of positive and negative space feeling that you've got going on with the actual forms of the flowers are quite flat and monochromatic. And then all the sort of busyness around them. How did that come together?
The use of the negative space again, it goes back to those principles of design, really, thinking back to my time spent in publishing, that idea of contrast and placement, black and white, the ultimate contrast, the use of positioning of your different elements, the ideas to do with collage, that is something that I'm really, really kind of compelled to continue to explore. And the idea of, the positive and the negative, there's a whole lot of things to do with dichotomies that I think about a lot. And, when I think about those works and I think about my childhood memories, and all of these plant species that I've chosen on were present in my childhood. So there's ideas to do with past and present and lost and found. And I always loved the poetry of William Blake and his songs of innocence and experience. And that idea of innocence and experience, again, a dichotomy, is something that I think about a lot with my work. An innocent child will look at the Brugmansia and not be aware of the potentially fatal toxicity of it if they chose to eat it or make tea from it. That would be really bad.
Yeah.
So innocence and experience is something that I think about often, and I again think about that idea of experiences. But the positive negative space, the flatness of the color, bringing in the ultimate contrast really in the work, using that as really just really strong kind of graphic, I guess, visual component.
It's really beautiful. And that dichotomy of the sort of simplicity and complexity, and the sort of busyness and the stillness. And it's, the more you look at it, actually, the more they bring you in like that. And I love the idea. I mean, they almost feel slightly Matisse-y, don't they, sometimes with that. They could be beautiful collages or like cut out pieces could have been placed as the flowers, or that they have a sort of mixed media feel about them, even though they are paintings.
Yeah, and it's funny you should say that because, right next to me on the floor is a piece of cutout wallpaper in the shape of an angel's trumpet flower, which I was actually exploring before I began the paintings. But that idea of cutout, and, I love Matisse's work, but cutout, is something that resonates with me. Definitely.
Yeah, it definitely does. And that comes through with your teaching. Some of the workshops that I've done with you are very much like that. And it's a great way to explore composition and form and space, isn't it? Actually doing those cutouts. So let's get on to the questions. What would you say is the most challenging aspect of being an artist?
Oh, this is a big question, isn't it? So I would have to say the most challenging aspect of being an artist is the financial challenge. And I think it was William Turner who said that success equals freedom. And when you don't have a strong income, it's really hard to be able to create the work that you want to make. And I have a partner that also works in the creative industries, and together we have to cobble an income between us, really. And in an ideal world, it would be amazing if there was such a thing as a living wage for an artist that, was not as low as what the dole is, was actually a wage that was feasible to live on. And just think how much more creative people could be if you had the headspace and the lack of financial stress in order to enable you to make your work.
You've spoken about Matisse, but who are the artists who really inspire your work?
Well, when I knew that you were going to ask this question, and when I thought about it, it is one of those really difficult questions to answer, much like if somebody said, who is your favorite musician, who are your favorite bands? The answer will alter dependent on your mood, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens So it's really hard to narrow it down. But for me, obviously, the Impressionists were really big when I was a teenager and someone in my early 20s. And I loved the work of Monet, and I love the painterliness. I'm particularly drawn to those Impressionist artists that used nature. What I love about Monet's work is the fact that in many cases it was so incredibly large scale. And so looking at the work becomes this really immersive experience. And that's something that I have hoped to create in my installation pieces, but definitely with my paintings, I want to, increase my scale more going into the future, because I am really keen to pursue this idea of the painting being a much more immersive thing that you can kind of get lost in. So Monet was really big for me. Turner, I always loved his work, especially the use of light in his work. Gustav Klimt, especially his nature-based paintings, so the ones that were about sunflowers and about orchards and about rose gardens. When I look at Klimt's work, that interest in pattern and detail and layering, that's there, I guess, in my work. Not that I'm even vaguely comparing myself to him, because I would never do that. But, the way that he painted the sunflower, for example, is just so stunning and so layered and so detailed and incredibly inspirational. Yayoi Kusama, I've always loved her work, especially her earlier pieces, so her infinity net paintings. Again, it's that immersive experience. The scale of those is huge. They're meters and meters long. And I know how long it takes to make this highly detailed work. So I can only imagine how long it took Yayoi Kusama as a young woman making those infinity net paintings. It would be, I don't know, months of repeating the same mark over and over and over and over again. I also really love her soft sculpture pieces, especially the ones with all the kind of finger-like or phallus-like, however you want to interpret it, but the soft sculptures of rowboats and chairs and things. And again, that compulsion to repeat the same process ad infinitum, and the dedication and the actual just hard bloody work to make something like that, that has always been inspiring. And with someone like Kusama, she's 95 now. She's still making her artwork. So on a different level, that's really inspiring. I really love Indigenous Australian art, especially the work of Emily Kame Ongware. Apologies for my probably terrible pronunciation. So her paintings, especially the Big Yam paintings, again, huge, immersive, really complex in terms of layering. She uses dark backgrounds a lot, and that kind of idea of sort of bringing forth the light. So starting off with a dark background and then painting up towards the light rather than starting off light and I guess painting towards dark. You're sort of doing it in reverse. But the wet into wet paint blends of those, and the way you can just get completely lost in the layering and in the painterliness of them is amazing. Colin McCann, I studied at school. I loved McCann. Again, there's a lot of darkness in the work. I live quite near McCann House. I walk past it pretty much daily, so I think about McCann a lot and how I'm looking at the trees that he painted, and I'm walking down the road that he walked up and down, and I'm swimming in the sea that he went to. Frances Hodgkins, I loved her work. I studied her when I was at school, and much like when my design director told me that type had personality and you could see it in the shapes of the letters, when I discovered through Hodgkins that you could do a self-portrait by using objects, not a painting of your face, that was amazing. And of course, with someone like Hodgkins, there's a lot of pattern in there. There's a lot of pattern. There's a lot of repetition. She used a lot of scarves and pieces of clothing that she placed her objects upon. And I guess that there's something sort of quite textile design-like about her work that I really love. Also, Henry Rousseau, Being Lost in the Garden, and more contemporary artist, John Poulet, New Zealand Niuean artist. When I first saw his works, I think that he was doing in the early 2000s, the works that had white backgrounds on these big kind of red blooms, or they were like blooms or stains or blood. They were quite wallpaper-like, but I think that was the first time that I stood in front of an artwork and I had kind of tears spring to my eyes. And as somebody that works in arts education and is around a lot of art, it's not very often that you come across those artworks that do kind of make you cry, much like every now and then a piece of music, or you'll discover a new band, or you'll see a film and it'll make you cry. Those experiences are incredible and they kind of stay with you. So Poulet's work, especially from the early 2000s, brought a tear to my eye. And I really love his more recent pieces, which are much more nature forward and much brighter and more colourful. David Hockney, particularly his more recent work, and also inspirational as an older artist, still making artwork well into his 80s. Marie Ito, Japanese artist, detailed, lots of dots, lots of patterns, quite whimsical. And hundreds more. Michael McHugh, Peter Doig, Catherine Maple, Richard Luer. I love his works because I love the storytelling aspect, the irony and the wit, but I also love the way he's painted them. Emma Bass, I really like her work. Kat Fuchs, the painterliness of it, the kind of the lusciousness of the paint, the stickiness of the paint. And Sarah Smuts Kennedy, the detailed, repetitive mark making, the layering, the use of color. My list is millions more long, but I think if there was an artwork that I was going to buy and that I wish I had bought in the past, it would be probably the work of George Shaw, who is nothing like any of the other artists I've mentioned, but British artist George Shaw, who paints these really banal suburban scenes in Britain. The work that he paints, that is my childhood in a painting, that is my childhood on a two-dimensional surface. And I just look at his work and it takes me back to the 70s and the 80s. And if you want to know about where I grew up, look at a George Shaw painting.
Really? That is amazing.
What I also love about his work is, he uses artists that use the materials in their work are also really important in terms of the meaning and add this extra level of kind of dimension. So Shaw uses Humbrol enamel paints to paint his paintings. And anyone who grew up when I grew up, pre-internet, pre-computer games, black and white TV, all the boys that I knew used to make Airfix models and paint them with Humbrol enamel paints. And so the fact that he's painting these paintings, which, as with all enamel paints, have this sort of lush stickiness to them.
Mm.
The meaning, the additional layer of meaning embedded in the materials that are being used to paint the painting is really great.
Yeah. Well, that is an A+ list. I think that's the best list that we've had after 124 episodes before you. That is such a great list, and it's like a sort of, you could almost write an art history book with some of those ideas that you've come up with. And last question, I probably know the answer to. I think we've kind of covered it, but would you like to expand on why you make the kind of work you make?
Why you make the kind of work you make, that is also a difficult question to answer. I mean, when I thought about this earlier, I thought, you make the work because you have to make the work. There's something within you that makes you have to make the work, and it's really hard to define and hard to explain. But I feel that if I didn't make my art, I would be like half a person. I would be I would not be being my real self if that art had not been able to come out. So, again, it is to do with this idea of art in some way being a sanctuary, being some form of therapy. I think it was Tracy Emin said, I need art like I need God, which is, not necessarily a spiritual, religious kind of a comment, but the fact that it's all encompassing. It's part of your life. It's like your faith. It's your reason for being. You wouldn't be you if you weren't doing it. And Frida Kahlo, that idea of, art is life. And I think it's the White Cliff little text on their logo, Arts Vita Est, art is life. And for some of us, creating makes us who we are. And for me, there's this kind of innate need or compulsion to make it, but it also, while it's challenging, and sometimes, my work has in the past been physically challenging and has, particularly the repetition of certain processes, they have caused physical pain. And when I was making a lot of work with wire, it used to jab me sometimes, and, blood was drawn. And so there's been literal pain in the making of the work, but the challenge of creating it is really satisfying. The enjoyment of then being able to share it with people is really fulfilling. Being able to make a connection, I think for me, that's what it comes back to, is this idea of being able to use your art to make connections with other people and to form relationships and to initiate conversations and feel that you have a shared experience, I guess. And if your art can do that, then that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I guess for me, in a way, art is like a sanctuary. And it does, for me, the making of my work, it does enable me to process a lot of things that I still deal with, I guess, that are sometimes quite challenging. But yeah, I couldn't not make it.
Mm. It's so interesting, isn't it, that there's, every guest I've spoken to pretty much has said the same thing, that there's this innate need to be making as we do, and then that sort of, I just find it so fascinating that everyone is drawn to a different kind of making. And I guess that is sort of representing the life that they've led, or, something has influenced that, or, whatever it is. It's just so interesting that so many people can connect to different types of visual art and then sort of express themselves in that way. Listening to you talking about those artists who inspire you, I feel like your work could be so beautiful. Firstly, really big, like you were speaking
Yeah.
of. I mean, and it might even bring you back to those sort of installations that you did when you were at university. You might
Yeah.
become more of an installation painter, kind of. I can imagine that. You can, now that you've spoken about it, I can see the design elements, and it does remind me of beautiful textile design or wallpaper. And, have you ever thought about kind of heading down that road with your work in some way?
I have often thought that it would make really nice fabric.
It really would.
But no, I have not explored it. But yeah, I mean,
I think you
if
should.
anyone's out there and wants my paintings, feel free to give me a call.
Oh my God. I mean, imagine that beautiful pastel one. Imagine that as a, you know, top and matching pants.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God. It's just been such a pleasure, Zoe, talking to you. And, I've got to know you a little bit through your classes that I've taken. And you are such a gorgeous person to work with. And I know that all the students in your class love you and love what you do. I think you bring so much to Browne School of Art. So highly recommend Zoe's workshops to our lovely listeners. Yeah, it's been really interesting hearing some of the backstories. I've always loved your work, and it just means even more to me now. So thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me so much, Mandy. It has been great fun talking to you. we talked far longer than I anticipated, but I feel like there's so much more that I could say. So thank you. Thank you again.
Oh no, thank you so much, Zoe. It's just been so much fun. And yeah, isn't it strange how you can actually speak for 2 hours and think actually I could speak for another 2 hours. I mean, it's like as humans we just are never allowed this kind of space to talk within. But it's
No,
actually surprising how much you've got to say.
yeah, yeah, no, and you never talk about what you're doing like this to anyone because everyone's so busy just getting on with what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, what you do with Creative Matters is such an incredible resource and so worthy, and I hope you get to continue doing it for a long time.
Thank you. That is the plan. Well, thank you so much once again, Zoe, and I'll see you on Saturday, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks.